A lot of the texts that Agrippa is using are not really occult books. I mean, these are books on philosophy. These are books on basically scientific books at the time. And I think I've said this before, that you don't always learn magic from reading just books on magic. And Agrippa is, I think, a very good illustration of that.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are so excited to talk about Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy with Eric Purdue. In addition to being a practitioner of medieval astrology and a centero in Lucumi, Santeria, Eric also has a new 896-page translation coming out of the occult classic Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, which will be released later in 2021 from Inner Traditions. I'm excited for many reasons to chat with Eric because of his erudition and his practical experience, but also because Eric's new translation of the 3 books of occult philosophy is a complete overhaul of the text, because it corrects the many mistranslations, copyist mistakes, and errors introduced from other editions, and draws on new research and access to Agrippa's source texts. It also restores all of Agrippa's original illustrations, and it presents a nearly complete bibliography of Agrippa's primary sources. In other words, Eric is the perfect person to speak with about the updates and restorations made to this coming 3 books of occult philosophy edition, as well as the key elements that justify a new translation, why it's not good to just read chapters out of the 3 books of occult philosophy completely out of context, something I am definitely guilty of. Also, how Eric validated the extensive sources in this new edition and translation of the 3 books. Eric also answers your excellent Glitch Bottle Patreon listener questions. Thanks to each and every patron. Much love to all of you. And Eric discusses so much more. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, let's welcome Eric Purdue. Eric Purdue, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
The honor is certainly mine. And before we get into kind of your massive, almost Lord of the Rings-esque style undertaking of the 3 books of occult philosophy, when did you first become interested in the occult or the esoteric?
When I was in kindergarten. Actually, almost that. Ever since I can remember, I've been fascinated by mythology. When I was in grade school, I was obsessed with Greek mythology, and I happened to be at the perfect age when I, Claudius was released on PBS. I think I was 6 years old. I watched every single episode. I probably didn't understand any of it, but I loved it. And of course, I had to dress up as everybody. And I gradually started to realize that people still believed in this stuff. I grew up like most of us in a predominantly Christian world, and or I didn't really go to church growing up, but that was the default answer to all the questions I had when I was a kid. So I would say around the time I graduated high school, I started becoming very serious in this. And I just bought books like everybody else. I didn't know where to start. I bought Starhawk, which sounds funny now. I bought Crowley's Magic and Theory and Practice, published by Dover, and a history on the Golden Dawn. And I figured that was just the way to go. So I read as much as I could and started asking around. This was in Chicago at this point. And I was a musician at this time. And my musician friend said, I know just the person to call. So he gave me this person's number. They had a very exotic sounding name. And I said, well, what do I do when I call him? And he said, well, I'll just tell him you want to make an appointment. And I said, about what? And he said, he'll know what you mean. And I'm thinking this is going to be some back alley secret entrance, to some, strange occult den or something. And so I called the number. The man who answered had a very aristocratic sounding voice. I said, I got your number from a friend and I would like to make an appointment. And then he said, for what? I have no idea what he said. So I said, look, I have no idea. this is what I've done. This is what I've read. I want to learn more. So he says, okay, fine, come by. So I went in there, and at the time, this was, I guess, 1990. At the time, this is before the internet. This was one of the few places that sold bulk incense and herbs and that kind of thing. So, and he was an artist, and he designed it like a 19th century apothecary, and it was very dimly lit. So it was something like in a movie. So we sat there and talked for hours. And of course, it looked very mysterious because you could barely see what these, containers contained in them, what was inside of them. There was not one word of leukemy or anything like that. He would just talk about the old ways and, kind of like typical neo-pagan talk. After a few hours, he asked if I trusted him. And I said, maybe. And he stood up, pushed on the wall, and a secret door opened. It turned out he liked secret doors a lot. He was like I said, he was an artist, and he loved secret doors. We went to a different room, and everything was Egyptian. He sat me down at a table in front of a life-size statue of Isis and gave me this leukemy oracle reading, which is called Dilagun. It's done with 16 small cowrie shells. And he proceeded to tell me about my life. And at that point, I said to myself that I want whatever he has. So I spent the next 15 years with him. I went, nearly every week or two to visit. Of course, there were ceremonies. I abandoned Crowley immediately at this point. In fact, I showed him what I was reading, and he just kind of literally threw it to the side, the book. I got initiated in leukemy in 2000 to Shango. And about 5 years later, my godfather passed. For those who don't know, your godparent is your teacher in leukemy. They call them padrinos, madrinas, or godfather, godmother, whatever. He passed about 5 years later, and I abandoned the religion at that point. There was so much drama. Our old leukemy house kind of fell apart at that point, or around that time. So I just didn't want any part in the drama. So that's when I started studying traditional astrology, except it was just astrology at that point. And I kind of rediscovered Agrippa, Picatrix. My first translation project was Picatrix, which was never published. That opened up a whole world because I didn't know that astrology, I didn't know there was a traditional astrology. I just thought there was astrology, like I think a lot of us think that it never really changed very much, except for extra planets or whatever. I started realizing that there were concrete and detailed techniques to learn very minute details about people or things or events that are happening. I realized that traditional astrology had the potential of giving me the experience I had with the leukemy Dilagun readings in many ways. And to me, that was a standard that I still am trying to achieve, is to get that concrete detail out of the reading and not, simply say, this is a time of bad energy, something vague like that. And I think that's what turns a lot of people off in astrology in general, is these kind of new age, vague psychological platitudes, which don't always explain everything. I was shocked to learn that is a very new phenomenon in astrology. It's only, in the last 100 years or so, 125 years. Before that, astrology was very different. So that was just a whole new rabbit hole that I went down. A few years back, I met my current godmother who adopted me. I got back into leukemy much deeper than I was even before that. I basically had this kind of split personality of esoteric Western book traditions on one side and Afro-Cuban oral tradition on the other side.
You mentioned that something in the quote unquote Western tradition, something in astrology kind of reminded you, or there were fingerprints in the Western tradition, quote unquote, that kind of reminded you of some of the elements of leukemy. Did it seem like it was completely separate at the time, or was there some cross-pollination as you continued to kind of, as you say, delve into the book tradition?
That's a complicated answer. I don't mix the two at all, ever. But there is a little bit of influence of the Western occult traditions in the Caribbean and South America. But it's hard to say that because people misunderstand that a lot. There's been a lot of talk about influences of certain grimoires or texts in Kimbanda or things like that. And if you go to a Botanica in Miami, in fact, the copy I have of the 6th and 7th books of Moses came from a Botanica, but I don't see any actual practice in something like Leucemy related to grimoires or Western practice directly. But where it gets a little bit complicated is that in Leucemy in particular, you also have an integration of European Spiritism, which is very widespread, and it works in tandem with the Afro-Cuban systems very well. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, they've kind of made that their own in a very unique way. It's not direct crossover, but there's a little bit of crossover because of people influence things. When you say there are footprints, I think what I meant was when I was getting readings in Leucemy, I was getting exact answers to my questions. If I would ask, is my job going well? It would give me a direct answer. And if not, it would give me remedies for that. And traditional astrology has that capability, except for the remedies part. I think in Western astrology, that is a little bit of a hole, I think, that many times remedies aren't really, it's not explicitly part of the system. In Indian astrology, it is a part of the system. It is very remedial. And what I've done in my practice when I do consultations is I try to search for a remedy based on astrological logic, but not from a specific source. And one of the beauties of traditional astrology is it does teach you how to think astrologically, because really, people like Agrippa or William Lilly, all these famous astrologers, they deviated from the texts in some cases because they understood the material so well. So it allowed you to sort of think outside the box, but within a certain framework as well. So you weren't necessarily coming from left field all the time. So I do try to find solutions when it's appropriate in ways that make sense within that framework, but I don't bring in Leucemy for that part of it. I have advised a few people to set up ancestral altars based on astrology readings. So that's an exception maybe.
When was the first time that Agrippa prominently factored into either the circumference of what you were learning about, or where there was even an element of, this needs to be looked into more?
So my godfather was unusual. Most Leucemy elders that you meet aren't necessarily well-versed in the Western occult tradition. There are a few. When he originally opened up his practice, it was in the mid-60s, and he was one of the early neo-pagan proponents. He was in full hippie mode back then. He had a teacher who I've tried to track down who this person is, and I cannot find him. I know his name. It was his old teacher, and this person died. And after this person died is when he brought in Leucemy. The story that he said, I found out later, is not true. He told all of us that he was from Spain, and he brought in Leucemy as a result of all this searching that he had done, almost like a critical search, where he was trying to find a religion that had oracles and initiations and lineages and that kind of thing. And he discovered Leucemy. It turned out he was born in Havana. I saw his birth certificate. It was actually part of his life. He just wasn't practicing it. His mother, I found out later, was a relatively well-known medium. So he grew up in the Spiritism tradition, Spiritismo. His mother did seances or misas professionally. That was her income. Because he initially did this through the neo-pagan world, he was also well read in the Western occult and esoteric traditions. So Agrippa was there. And I remember him telling me about Agrippa. And he also told me about Picatrix in the mid-90s. He didn't know that there was a critical edition at the time. So he had read it at that stage, or actually ever. We talked about Agrippa. And so Agrippa was always on my radar. And when he passed away, I realized I needed to get some grounding. I wanted to sort of learn what everyone else was doing. So I picked up Agrippa and I read it cover to cover, and it took me forever. I didn't understand everything. Yeah, it struck me in that it was so systematized and very logical in a way that I really hadn't seen in the Western tradition so much. It gives you the reasoning behind why we do these things. That gave me the doorway to traditional astrology, that and going through Picatrix. They're both using terminology that is not in modern astrology. So I had to look this up. and I realized that there was a different rabbit hole that I had to go down. I started studying William Lilly. After I started working through William Lilly's book, I went back to Agrippa, partially through my own investigation and partially through discussions with Chris Warnock. I saw there were a lot of problems with the translation of Agrippa as we had it. But the problem is it wasn't always clear whether it was Agrippa or the translation. Sometimes the translation really seemed suspect. Agrippa does get blamed for a lot of errors, which I've later discovered aren't always warranted. So my first project was Picatrix, and I abandoned it when I discovered that Chris Warnock and John Michael Greer were about to publish theirs. I was struggling with the botanical names in Picatrix and some of the animal names, and I was kind of happy to give it up. I had a really good excuse to give it up. So after a couple of years, I decided to tackle Agrippa, and it was just an experiment. I just literally started with chapter 1. And by, I think, the second chapter, I started to realize there were some issues.
To your point, Eric, can you give us a little bit of the broad strokes in terms of the history of the 3 books? I think there might be obviously many listeners who are very familiar with it and the relationship between Agrippa and Tritemius and the year 1510. But for those of us who might not be, can you just share with us about how did the 3 books come into being?
It's important to remember, first of all, that Agrippa was a person of his time. So the magical worldview was assumed. The existence of spirits were assumed. Everybody believed in astrology to some extent. So there's that. So Agrippa grew up learning astrology. It is said that he learned astrology from his father, and I am not clear. I haven't found any evidence to how deep that really was. I don't really know how good of an astrologer Agrippa was, or if he did natal charts or what. He was a doctor, so I assume that he must have done astrology in a medical sense. But anyway, he started with his interest in the esoteric arts very early. I guess to make a very long story short, he traveled around a lot. When he was a young adult, he became friends with a group of like-minded people. It is often called a secret society. I don't know how organized this really was. It was, at the very least, it was a mutual aid society, if nothing else. And I think Agrippa developed the breadth of his knowledge probably during that time. That is my guess. But regardless, he did meet with the abbot Tritemius in sometime in actually 1509. And he didn't spend a lot of time with him. So this wasn't like a long, decade-long student-teacher type of relationship. He spent a few months with him, is more like it. But Tritemius is, of course, very influential on his own. So in 1510, Agrippa sent Tritemius a draft of his 3 books. It was a manuscript, and Tritemius approved it. That letter's in 3 books of occult philosophy. That 3 books of occult philosophy is much smaller than what we know today. So, estimates are probably around maybe a third smaller, give or take. Between 1510 and the eventual publication of 3 books, a lot happened. He became, he was a secret agent. He was a soldier. He was kind of like a lawyer for, different royal people. I suspect he worked to some capacity in Henry VIII's court to some extent. Towards the end of his life, he received royal permission to publish several titles. Most of these titles were books that he had written previously, but never published. Within a couple of years, there was a flurry of books being published by him. And 3 books was literally the last one. That was in 1533. It's kind of important to keep in mind that the first draft of 3 books was written when he was 23 years old. That's going to make you feel like you haven't accomplished anything in your life. So that came out when he was very young. So in between 1510 and 1533, several things happened. First of all, Agrippa became more established as a scholar. He was a well-known scholar of Johannes Reuchlin. He actually used to teach Johannes Reuchlin in the university, which wouldn't you love to take that class? And other developments are that Johannes Reuchlin published The Art of Kabbalah, and another writer who a lot of people today don't know about. His name is Franciscus Giorgio, who wrote a large book called Harmonia Mundi, The Harmony of the World. That book is physically larger than 3 books of occult philosophy. It's an enormous book. I did think about translating that at one point, but then I realized that Agrippa did take the best parts. It's a pretty tough book to read. There's some Kabbalistic and some esoteric Christian information in there, but it's a rough book to read. But yeah, so the material that Agrippa used from Harmonia Mundi, especially Harmonia Mundi, more than almost anything else, enlarged the size of 3 books. Agrippa, while he was doing all this, had been working on revising 3 books because earlier versions of his manuscript had leaked out. And he was basically being held accountable for this earlier draft. And Agrippa realized that he needed to take control of the situation. So he decided to write the book the way he wanted it to be written and then properly release it so that really no one can say that he was saying something he didn't believe in anymore. 3 books was the very last book that he published, and he passed away sometime in the next, a couple years after that. They don't know exactly the date. This kind of brings up the question about whether or not he believed in, because he wrote a famous retraction. So this retraction is part of a book that was published in the same group of books that 3 books came out of. It's a book called On the Uncertainty and Vanity of the Sciences, or Uncertainty and Vanity of the Sciences. This book is, I guess you could call it a satire in a way. It was a sarcastic book written to show how the entirety of human knowledge is really not as certain as we think it is. It is based on our own knowledge, which is flawed, and that knowledge changes over time. So why take this too seriously to begin with? So actually, the last part of the English version of 3 books has those short chapters, on Goetia and that kind of a thing. That actually comes from The Uncertainty and Vanity of the Sciences. That's not part of my edition. It's not part of the original version. But anyway, so this retraction's in there. So some people say that it was a true retraction. Some people say that he didn't really mean it. The answers we really don't know. But I think it's important to remember a couple of things. The first is the context of the book that it was contained in. It was a sarcastic book to begin with. So it's uncertain how serious this retraction was. Second of all, while he was writing this retraction, he was revising his edition on 3 books. So it wasn't like he wrote 3 books a long time ago and then decided to disavow but publish it anyway. He was actually actively working on it. So my sense is that it wasn't a true retraction. That's my opinion.
In addition to that, Eric, you mentioned that, quote, all English editions of the 3 books are based on the 1651 JF translation. Can you share the historical background of this first Latin to English translation and who the translator might be? Because I know many listeners are obviously, using the editions that were translated into English.
A lot of the exact history isn't really even available, and the identity of JF isn't really 100% certain. The overall context, I think, of its publication is that during the 17th century in England, there was a sort of mini Renaissance in the esoteric arts in general. So, the majority of the alchemical works that we have now were written, or at least were released during that time, if not written then. The first English manual on astrology was written in 1647 by William Lilly. Elias Ashmole was pushing the publication of a lot of these books. So this book came out of that little wave, that little mini Renaissance that was happening. Some of the earlier sources say that the writer is James Freak, and other people say that it's John French, who was an alchemist. I know Joseph Peterson says that he believes it was John French. I don't know enough to argue against that. It feels fairly likely, but we don't know who James Freak was. That's one of the problems. We can't really make a good comparison. John French is known for his alchemical texts, and this book is a little bit different. I don't know. It's hard to make that exact comparison, unfortunately.
We definitely know for a fact, in 1651, it was translated from Latin into English. And one of the things that you mentioned a few moments ago, Eric, is that when you first started reading the 3 books of occult philosophy, you didn't get very far until you said, wait a second, there might be some issues here. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about when and why did you first decide, hey, there needs to be a new translation of the 3 books?
Well, I knew someone had to do it. First of all, I didn't know that person was going to be me, and I didn't really take it that seriously when I started. The one thing that we definitely knew was there was a passage. It is in chapter 59 of book 1. And it's a simple election for times when dreams are going to become more effective. And for those who don't know, electional astrology is a technique of timing events or things, astrologically speaking. So timing the right time to do something according to certain astrological considerations. The first error that we noticed, and actually Chris Warnock pointed this out first, is on the last paragraph. Agrippa says that the most effective dreams are when the moon runs through the 9th sign of the nativity or solar revolution of that year, or in the 9th sign from the sign of profection. And that word profection was a problem for JF. He translated this as perfection. And Donald Tyson then looked at this translation and made a footnote to describe what perfection meant. And he looked at this as the sign of the new or full moon, which I assume would be previous to that. So anyone who knows traditional astrology knows this word perfection. So perfection is a predictive tool that you use. And it basically, each sign of the zodiac represents a year. When you're born, that first year is represented by the first house. Then on your first birthday is the second house. And then it just moves around the chart over and over and over again. So Chris noticed this problem first, and I didn't know it was worse than what he saw. So first there was this mistranslation, and then JF just kind of threw out the term revolution. Donald Tyson looked at it and assumed that revolution just meant just your birthday, which isn't really strictly true. And so it just it started getting a little deeper and deeper and deeper. I translated that paragraph first just to see what it looked like. When I realized that it looked pretty different, I started going through the first chapter. So I think it was in somewhere in the first 5 chapters when he's talking about Earth, the element of Earth. And JF says that Plato said that the Earth is changeable. And then Donald Tyson made a footnote saying, oh, Agrippa didn't know his Plato very well. Earth is actually inchangeable. And I looked at the Latin, and Agrippa did it correctly. It was unchangeable. That made me realize that it wasn't just a simple issue of astrological terms being mistranslated. There were actually very mundane terms that were mistranslated. And what's interesting when I started working on it is that JF did the basic Latin well, more or less. I mean, everybody has mistranslations somewhere. His Kabbalistic material seemed pretty good. Every time he got into astrology, it became just a massive mess. But I realized that since it wasn't just the astrology and that there were errors peppered throughout the book, I just couldn't take that for granted. So I started at the beginning and worked my way through it.
Eric, to that point, you also mentioned that JF, for example, and I know many listeners will be familiar with this, especially when it's so important to show fidelity to the original intent and sources. JF translates daimon as spirit.
Yes.
Can you share a little bit about this?
Nearly every time, not every single time, but almost every time. So daimon, I mean, now I don't think this is terribly unknown. I mean, I think a lot of people know this now, but daimon is a really more complex term than the modern usage of the word demon. So daimon originally was a Greek term that, depending on the context, sometimes it just meant a deity, but other times it could be almost like an attending spirit in some cases. By the time I got to Agrippa, they were, of course, contextualizing this in a Christian sense. So to Agrippa I'm really coming from Ficino, they contextualize a demon or daimon as just a lower level spirit, a more terrestrial spirit that wasn't necessarily evil or good. They could be either one, sometimes ambivalent. So one of the mysteries is why I don't know why JF did that. Just like I don't know why he mistranslated astrological terms that were common during that time. Being as well versed with the Latin literature as JF apparently was, I don't know why he changed the translation of that. So you get into a little bit of confusion. So in the planetary seal section, you have things like, the seal of the planet, the intelligence of the planet. And Agrippa says that you use the intelligence for good and then use the diamond for evil. And so the JF says use spirit for evil, but it makes it sound strange when you're saying spirit because why is the spirit necessarily evil? So it definitely makes it a little more confused. And other peppered throughout the rest of the text, he does the same thing. He'll be talking about, different levels of spirit where he'll say things like, okay, we have intelligences, we have, thrones, then we have spirits. So I think this makes it a little bit clearer.
How did you kind of mollify or address the archaic English? Because I know that can be definitely a challenge if you're looking at a translation from the mid 1600s for the first time and you're trying to apply it. So how did you go through that in terms of going back to the original Latin and then translating it and kind of working with, especially that tradition of the archaic English? How did you work through that?
Well, thankfully I got used to it by reading William Lilly a lot of the 17th century astrologers. I was already accustomed to reading older English, which, by the way, it's kind of funny. That English is considered to be early modern, believe it or not. So my approach was to start first with the Latin, and I just ignored the JF version completely. So I worked through the Latin by itself, and then I would go back to the JF version and compare what they were saying. And then the third step would be to compare Tyson's version, because Tyson also made changes. The preference is to go from the Latin and just translate it plainly. There are some terms that I think are hard, that are misleading. The one that came to the top of my mind was Agrippa in JF's translation. He often says that numbers are formal. And that's actually a correct translation. But the word by itself is a little bit problematic, because when you say formal, we think of like formal dress, like, wearing a tuxedo or something. So that doesn't make sense for numbers. If you think about it for a minute, you could say, okay, well, maybe it's referring to the realm of the Platonic forms. That makes sense. And I think if you pause enough to think about it, you can figure that out. So I would, instead of just saying formal, I would say the numbers are like a form or more of a form, something like that. So I would sort of approach it that way. The poems that Agrippa uses, however, it's a bit rough in JF to read that. And I think that sometimes it kind of obscures the reason why Agrippa put the poetry in there, because it's so flowery. The JF version is so flowery that you can understand it. I mean, it isn't like no one can understand what he's saying, but a lot of us, me included, aren't necessarily going to spend that much time going through the poetry. So I think a lot of people skim through it. I mean, it's interesting that Agrippa is using poetry as a way to frame his argument to begin with, because no one would do that today in an occult text or a modern scientific text. That's really the comparison we're making. So what I did was when I translated the poetry, I made no attempt at replicating the meter or rhyming or anything like that. That's kind of where JF gets a little bit messed up, as he tries to rhyme everything. So I just translated it plainly. I figure if you want to read Virgil, there are better translations out there, probably Virgil, academic translations that are excellent. I kind of wanted to make the passage that Agrippa chose make sense within the context of the rest of the text.
One of the other issues that you address, Eric, too, is, and people can check out, for instance, book 2, chapter 22, incorrect graphics. How did you overhaul the graphics? How did you, maybe not overhaul, but how did you properly match or correct some of the graphic problems in some of the earlier versions?
So Tyson noticed the same problem, which is why he did what he did with the book. And the planetary seals, which is what you're referring to, are very obvious. Thankfully, due to the internet, I had multiple editions of Agrippa to go off of. These different editions can get a little bit messy sometimes, because sometimes they, even though they're printed, they sometimes contain errors or differences. But the planetary seals were relatively consistent in all of the Latin editions. Specifically, I believe it's the intelligence of Mercury was flipped around, so it's kind of oriented differently than it should be, which I know a lot of your audience they kind of know sigil 101 and using gematria to make a seal. And you'll see that it doesn't really line up properly. And I noticed that Tyson found an issue with this too, because the superior planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and the sun, pretty much make sense. But when you get to the inferior planets, it starts to get a little bit messier. Tyson had a hard time replicating Agrippa's results. I want to say he made a comment that he just made an error. Then I discovered that by looking at the facsimile editions, that they were just simply flipped in some cases. Towards the end of book 1, there's a chapter on the letters of the planets. That one's a mess. I've seen, I think, 3 or 4 versions of that. So in that case, I picked one and made a footnote. Some of them, I think it's Jupiter, it's literally flipped upside down in some editions. And it's important to add to that. I've been trying to work through these sigils a little bit in my head. There's actually an article written, it was published by the Warburg Institute sometime in the 60s, I think, where someone tried to do this. And I haven't spent the time to actually try it, but there's some logic to those sigils that isn't obvious. Part of the logic is that the sigils, the points for the sigils are actually extend off of the magic square. But I haven't really replicated it yet. That's part of the difficulty I think people have had in replicating these two, because it's again, the inferior planets make sense. They're all contained within the square. Then once you get to Mercury, and I think the moon, it starts to veer off a little bit in logic.
In addition, Eric, to the kind of menagerie of reasons for the genesis of your new 3 books of occult philosophy, one of the issues that you sought to address or kind of correct is what is effectively a compounding problem. And can you share a little bit about how when JF, whoever JF is, in the mid 1600s, translated the 3 books from Latin to English, that the errors in JF's version were picked up by later researchers, compilers, scholars, and that it kind of amplified the errors. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, there are some miscellaneous botanical names that are mistranslated. One of the ones that sent me down a rabbit hole was, I think it was a chapter on incense. And it was either the fixed stars or the mansions, one of the mansions. But one of the ingredients was, the Latin is carabe, Carabe. And everybody, including JF, it was a star because it's in the 15 fixed stars text. That's well known. So pretty much anybody who's translated that, or most people who've translated that, translate that as carob. And I'm no stranger to unusual ingredients in incense, but there's something that kept bugging me about carob as an ingredient, because it seemed weird to me. I did some digging. Without naming names, I found a prominent website that documents some of these older ingredients, and they translated this as asphaltum. And so I wrote this person. I said, where did you get this from? And they said, I got this from a 19th century pharmacist's apothecary guide. And he linked it to me. It was on Google. So I found it. Sure enough, it said that. But that still sat oddly with me, because I know that asphaltum could be an ingredient. It was an ingredient in Kefi incense, the Egyptian incense. So I knew that was possible, but it seemed odd as just a primary ingredient for something. So I dug a little more and I discovered that it was a lesser known regional name in Spain and France for amber. I want to say JF translated it as jet, if I remember correctly, but definitely not amber or carob. It might have been carob, but I don't think it was. So those kind of things happen. The biggest thing was with the compounding that I was personally experiencing was this astrological material. Not to put too much blame on Donald Tyson. When the 3 books when he did his edition of it, I think it came out in 91, 93, something like that. At that time, there wasn't as much material available to us about traditional astrology. So since the 90s, I think in my personal possession, I have about 20 books, translations, plus I have about 200 PDFs of 17th century books on astrology. And maybe not 200, but pretty close to it. So I have a lot of books on this. And those just weren't available to the general public at that time. So Tyson was mostly going off of Ptolemy. But Ptolemy is a little bit of an anomaly as well, and didn't necessarily represent the entirety of the astrological tradition very well. So I can't really blame him entirely for this, but it does make for a problematic translation. So, example, there's a section where he mentions the Latin is termini, which is term in English, or bound. The terms in traditional astrology are a five-fold division of each sign, 5 unequal divisions. It's one of the traditional ways of determining planetary strength, basically. So Agrippa mentions the terms, and the Latin's termini, and JF translated it as marks. So the Tyson looks at it and says, okay, what's a mark? So he translated it as a degree. So Agrippa is talking about astrological, they're called essential dignities, astrological ways of determining planetary strength. Now the English translation says it's a degree. A degree makes no sense in that context. There's another place Agrippa mentions, I think it's on the chapter on the number 3, mentions the decans, which are well known today to a lot of occultists too. So the decans are a 10-degree division of each sign. So there's 3 per sign. These are alternately known as faces or decans. They're basically the same thing. There's different ways of calculating these. There's an Indian version, there's a Western version, but basically 10-degree division of a sign. So Agrippa says, okay, there are 3 faces and decans. And JF translated it as faces and heads. I don't remember how Tyson dealt with that one. But as a casual reader, you look at this, it really makes no sense. Why would there be 3 faces and heads? It doesn't make a lot of sense there.
Because of JF's original translation and with some of the issues there, it's almost like casting, a smooth stone into a pond, and there are these ripples that just tend to kind of amplify, whether correct or not, based on the resources and the sources that are available at the time. Right. It'll just kind of replicate it.
Yeah, one of the botanical names that I noted down here was in chapter 32 of book 1, he mentions the word sange. That's how JF translated it. It's actually sage. But Tyson looks at sange, and of course, sange is very close to the word for blood. So he's like, oh, it's bloodroot, which is very different than sage.
This is something where I know that yourself and myself, I know this is something that all of us really appreciate. The Tyson versions, obviously, hugely influential and so much scholarship and research. And I think that's what you're saying, Eric, is that given the sources available at the time, that is what Tyson and other people had to work with. And it was absolutely fantastic. And then you kind of started looking at the original source work and then found even more things and more dots that are being connected to just kind of give as full a picture as possible of the existing material.
Yeah, and there are cases where JF left out things, and there are cases where he added things. There are little bits of text. And there's a section where they talk about mandrake, and he talks about having to pull it in an upward motion. I mean, you always pull things out of an upward motion, but I think he meant like pulling it away from you. That's not in Agrippa at all. But I know that that's part of folk herbal lore, which presumably JF was familiar with, but it's not part of the book.
To that point, we have a listener question for you, since we've been discussing other versions, from Tully. And Tully is asking, I'm most interested in finding out if there's anything I should be amending or writing into my copy of Donald Tyson's translation. Tully says, looking forward to our chat.
Every change that I made, I footnoted, first of all. And by that, I mean that if JF said something, then I would say, okay, JF's translated it X way with the Latin. So if someone doesn't believe me, they can look at the Latin. What I also did was if JF did something correct, but then Tyson changed or altered in some way, I would note that as well. Or in cases where JF was wrong, but Tyson corrected, I would also note that. So I tried to do that. I also noted times when Agrippa made a mistake, but I kept the original.
As someone goes through your book, if they, are on page 283 and they see a footnote, they can go there and they can see right on the same page,
exactly.
Here's where something was changed, here's where something was left the same, and here's who did it, basically.
Right. And sometimes I agree with those changes. I mean, sometimes those changes are correct. I'm not bad-mouthing Tyson here at all. Especially with some of the botanical names, Tyson did a pretty good job of figuring a lot of these out. So there are times when, where the herb is actually kind of ambiguous. Tyson did a good job on, figuring a lot of this out. And I would say that too. I said, according to Tyson, it's probably this herb, and he's likely correct. Again, I leave the Latin. It goes in all directions, all of the footnotes. I'll probably make some myself, some errors too. But yeah, I think to answer your question, I think that's the best way to do is to cross-reference it. The only other alternative is to learn the source material. I mean, I guess learning astrology, which is, it's tough. And if you're just going by Tyson's or a PDF of JF's version, if you're just going by that, there aren't enough clues, I think, to really notice that there's a problem in all cases. In some cases there are, but in a lot of cases there really aren't.
Obviously, massive respect to Donald Tyson and all of the work that he did. And this actually brings up, Eric, a very important point that you make in your upcoming translation, which you say, quote, "Our translation attempts as much as possible to cite sources that were available to Agrippa," unquote. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about why is this so vitally important, especially, maybe if someone a couple hundred years later was doing research, they might have plugged in or used sources that were not available to Agrippa. Can you share a little bit about this?
I think it's important because Tyson attempted to do this, but I don't think there was enough information available for him to really accurately do it. So there are cases when Tyson will annotate something, and really what he's saying is not necessarily incorrect in some cases, but the source is from some book that was written in the 19th century. And that always begs the question as to where Agrippa got his information from. I think, since Western occultists are so book-based, we always want to know where things come from. And there's this kind of myth that has been talked about a lot over the years, and I think maybe Tyson may have said this too, that Agrippa is using sources that are no longer available, or were only available in these kind of, dark, dusty libraries in a monastery somewhere. But the thing is Agrippa really wasn't that guy. Agrippa was a mainstream scholar of his time. So he was using sources that were, for the most part, pretty easy to get. So that also means that it's easy to get for us. So it is possible to have the vast majority of the books that Agrippa had access to thanks to the internet. So I was able to, through Google, many libraries around the world have digitized copies of their books available. So in some cases, I was able to get exact editions that Agrippa probably had, at least the years lined up. You can see for yourself exactly what he's using. And I think it kind of brings up a point about magic, that a lot of the texts that Agrippa is using are not really occult books. I mean, these are books on philosophy. These are books on basically scientific books at the time. And I think I've said this before, that you don't always learn magic from reading just books on magic. And Agrippa is, I think, a very good illustration of that. He's using just the books on the natural world of his time. And granted, to us, some of this looks like occult because it's not part of our natural science today. And really, the occult in 3 books of occult philosophy he means hidden, of course. We all know the occult means hidden. But a lot of times people always interpret that as meaning that it's a secret, that it's knowledge that you cannot divulge to other people. But to someone who reads Latin academically, as Agrippa would have, he would also interpret that as the hidden effects of things. So to quote the Insane Clown Posse, why do magnets work? Which Agrippa says that too, by the way. Why do magnets work? That's an example of an occult power. So it's not necessarily because of demons or because of magic per se. It's because we can't see why these things do what they're supposed to do. What makes a tree a tree? Why do certain herbs cure us? Those are all occult powers. So he's running the gamut of practical, these are things that we don't understand yet, or these are things that help us, all the way to hardcore magic, as we would define it today. I think that, to any of the occult nerds out there, I think we'd like to see what his library looked like. Thankfully, with help of the critical edition and just the technology available to us today, I was able to get almost all of the books that he cited. They're all in the bibliography. There is one important one that I was not able to get a hold of, which is the one for the planetary seals that only exists in a manuscript.
You are effectively, and I think you mentioned this in the introduction, you are reconstructing, but also demystifying Agrippa's library. Whereas so many people are like, I wonder what books Agrippa had and this and that. It's you actually really do document that.
He might be quoting, and I tried to note some of this as well. Not in every case, but in a lot of cases, he might be talking about something that he got from Ficino, for instance. And it might be a direct quote from Ficino, but Ficino's quoting some classical author. So I tried to note that as well, the secondary sources as well, because really everybody was doing the same thing. They were just sourcing whatever books they had available to them. And one of the things that I've sort of recently learned is that there wasn't as much of a variety of sources available as we kind of hoped there would be. I know astrologically speaking, there were maybe a handful of Arabic books that made it to Europe, and all these Latin authors, astrological authors, oftentimes only had access to maybe 5 or 6 books, something like that. And I think that's with the magic, that's sort of the same issue. We have this very tiny pool of sources. But one thing that surprised me is there are no grimoires directly sourced in 3 books.
For one of the most, in fact, the most quoted kind of Western esoteric book, the 3 books of occult philosophy, no grimoires are actually sourced there.
Picatrix is. I don't know if you consider Picatrix a grimoire. So if you do, then yes, there's one. But the Keys of Solomon are not in there. Grimorium Verum not in there. Heptameron not in there. He mentions the writers by name, but they're not actually quoted.
Is this why, for example, you mentioned that when Agrippa, for example, is referencing a Bible passage or a quote from Plato, he's not directly quoting the Bible or directly quoting Plato, but rather he's mentioning other sources that are citing Plato or the Bible. Can you elaborate on that?
In those exact cases, I think it's a little different. I think that was an expedience because he certainly had a copy of the Bible, and he almost certainly had, I think he did have Ficino's Opera Omnia, which also has translations of Plato. So I think he would have had that. It's much simpler to quote someone else's work. I'll give an example, like on his sections on the numbers, there's always part of those chapters where he's mentioning Bible verses. In cases like that, yeah, he's using someone else's work because it's a lot harder to go through the Bible and find every time they mention the number 3, for instance. In Plato, what I've noticed is that he rarely even quotes exact quotes from Plato. Usually it's from Ficino's Platonic theology. It's not even Plato. It's like it's an interpretation of Plato referring to Plato. So I would also note that. So, he would, for instance, he would quote something from Ficino where he's describing Ficino's opinion on what part of Timaeus might be, for instance. But it's actually referring to part of Timaeus, but you're never going to find that quote in Plato itself. He does quote Iamblichus, though, directly. I think a lot of people aren't aware that probably 90% or so of 3 books is actually direct quotes. You'll have a paragraph, but that paragraph is, literally copied and pasted pretty much from, maybe 5 sources. He'll string these sentences along and maybe add his own linking words like and whatever. But there's very little actually original material in Agrippa.
90% of that is
that's my guess because it's very dense that way. In that way, there's a couple times when he mentions his own experiences in there, but for the most part, there's an important reason for that. First of all, it wasn't terribly uncommon to do that. A lot of people today will criticize him and say, okay, well, he's a plagiarist, but that wasn't a concept. It was actually encouraged at the time because that's how you showed what you knew. That was one important reason why he did that. But the other reason is that he is using these quotes to create his own narrative, which is a fascinating idea. So as much as you might want to label him a plagiarist, try taking your library and taking passages out of the books that you own, but making your own argument, your own unique spin on that. What's fascinating is that, while he's directly quoting Ficino and Pico and all these other people, he's actually making arguments that they were not making themselves. For instance, Ficino and Trithemius in particular had their own ideas on what magic was and the role of magic in this Christian universe. But, their definitions created their own special set of problems. And Agrippa addressed that by quoting other authors. That was part of his reasoning. But the other part too was he explicitly states this, that he wanted to show that his ideas on magic and spirits in general were actually compatible with the Christian church. He is quoting Christian church fathers as part of this too, which, I mean, Ficino was trying to do that too, and so is Trithemius. Some of the definitions on what made certain kinds of magic okay and other kinds of magic not okay, sometimes were not defined very well by either of them. So Agrippa was there to sort of make his own stamp there. I think he actually probably did a better job than both of them in that sense.
That is incredible. So even though approximately 90% of the kind of material, as you mentioned, Agrippa is quoting other sources, other authors, he's at the same time simultaneously presenting a completely idiosyncratic, a completely, almost, dare I say, like autobiographical account of his own view on how magic and the occult and the esoteric can be compatible in a Christian universe.
Yes, and that's actually a very important question at that time, because you couldn't just simply say astrology was bad, or you couldn't simply say magic was bad, because the Bible talks about magic and astrology. So, astrology was widely used in medicine, for instance, and astrology and magic were widely used by the public. And the church knew about this. They couldn't really stamp it out. In some cases, this magic took the form of the ways they worship saints in certain parts of Europe. These were never sanctioned by the church, but it's difficult to really get rid of that. That was a very important question that he had to answer. And Ficino was doing the same thing. He was commissioned by the Medicis to translate Plato into Latin for the first time. But then, the next question is going to be, well, what do I do? What do we do with this knowledge? Because on one hand, they're revering classical knowledge, but on the other hand, they're kind of almost rejecting it. And neither one of those extremes really makes sense in that world. So they have to reconcile this somehow.
Eric, what is your sense of what was the mentality of Agrippa in writing this in terms of the scope that he envisioned for it?
I think that the Agrippa who wrote the original manuscript and the Agrippa who published the book are different Agrippas. I don't know his original intention. To me, it feels like he was demonstrating his knowledge to someone he respected, first of all. I don't know if he intended to publish it, but Agrippa was not published for a while. I think he was in his, probably not for another 10 years or so, but roughly 10 years after he did that manuscript, he started publishing. I think that by the time he did the final edition, he was older and wiser. And as I said earlier, he wanted to sort of put a stamp on his own narrative, because he wanted to make sure that whatever was going to be said about him was at least going to be in his own words, or from his own words. I do think he meant it to be widely disseminated. He had to be careful in doing so. He made some disclaimers in the beginning, saying, hey, please don't blame me for my young self for writing these words. I think that he believed it. He had students. Wire is a famous student, and he was certainly doing magic himself. So yeah, I do think he was trying to put his own stamp on it. But also I think, there was those stories about Agrippa where he, made the argument to the inquisitor to let the elderly woman free, who was going to be burned at the stake as a witch. And he successfully made an argument that freed her. He did so by using almost a backhanded compliment. He was just like, okay, look, she's old. What is she going to do? But he had a very rational view of what magic was. And I think that he was trying to get rid of this, almost like a superstitious knee-jerk reaction against it that the church had, and in some cases the public had, to show that, okay, this is rational. The people that we respect, the ancients that we respected, also believe this.
A low-key normalization effort, really. I mean, something where it's like, yes, of course, spirits or diamonds, et cetera, can be evil. There can be practices, but in a Christian universe, the church and people who want to investigate these things should not automatically reject all occult knowledge, correct, all wisdom as evil, malignant. It should be, just cast away.
Right. Because these are things that are there. He tried to show that, he's quoting Augustine to support his argument, but I don't think it worked.
Right. Touche.
But he tried.
Well, can you share to that point, Eric, about how the three books are divided and very crucially, how the three books as you say, are built effectively brick by brick. I think this is just a really fascinating point.
To start with, the 3 books are divided into 3 sections that are each called books, which the 3 sections are the natural world, the celestial/mathematical world, and the divine world. And numbers actually belong to the divine world as well. They cross boundaries. First of all, on the surface, he's starting very low level. He's starting with the elements, the building blocks of all matter. And he gradually moves upwards to God. And it's very methodical. The first real chapter of the book, which I think is chapter 2, he starts out with defining what magic is, which was interesting to me because how many books on magic do we have out there that don't define magic?
That is a good point.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people just parrot Aleister Crowley's definition, which I always hated. But Agrippa starts out with, first of all, what is magic? And then he goes right into what the elements are. And that's very important because in the Ptolemaic worldview, which he would have had at that time, the elements are almost like the boundary between us and the celestials in a lot of ways. And the elements are kind of the reason why things are the way they are on Earth, all the good and bad that comes with that. So he starts out with that and really fascinating descriptions of the elements, because I think a lot of people don't fully understand why that's so important. And it's really made me think about it differently, because I basically had that revelation years back that the elements were not, it's easy to think of earth as earth and fire as the fire that we know, and air as wind or whatever. And it is those things. But I had that revelation a while back that these were qualities, which I know is not a revelation to everybody now, but he goes into a lot of detail about these qualities. And it's important to realize that a stone, for instance, could have the qualities of any number of elements within them, even though they're primarily of the element of earth. But anyway, he starts out with that basic foundational principle, and then he just gradually moves up on that. Why certain plants have special qualities. Why can we use some of them as medicine and others as poisons? And why do magnets work? Yeah, I love that one. And he goes into immediately on the herbal correspondences with the planets and why that's even a thing. How can a plant or an animal or a stone actually say something about a planet? And he defines these things. But anyway, so he started with that, and then he gradually moves up to the celestials. And it's actually kind of gradual, because the end of book 1 starts to kind of veer into that territory, because he kind of goes into the basics of the letters a little bit. And alphabets are kind of this weird, kind of occupy this strange space in between something physical and something not. Alphabets go into all 3 worlds, according to Agrippa. So he goes into letters, he goes into numbers. In the celestial world, the numbers are the basis for astrology. Goes into the proportions of the human body, like the Vitruvian man, directly that, actually. He quotes that entire chapter from Vitruvius. Then you gradually move to the divine world, because the divine world is where things get a little bit more philosophical and a little bit more conceptual, because you have all this knowledge with the natural world, and then you have this astrological and mathematical knowledge. Then what do you do with it, with this knowledge? So he starts to describe, he puts all that together into the 3rd book, where you're putting this mathematical knowledge into the alphabets, and you're putting this knowledge of the natural effects of the planets into ceremonial context and that kind of a thing. And I think what throws off some people is that Agrippa doesn't really tell you what the ceremonies are supposed to be. And I think some people brush off 3 books because they don't have the recipes in there like they want. But Agrippa lays it out. I mean, why should you even do a ceremony to begin with? What are you doing during a ceremony? For instance, not are you drawing a magic circle, or are you saying the right word? What's the purpose of you doing these things? Why do you even light a candle to begin with? And these are all important things I think we need to be able to answer for ourselves. When I say it's brick by brick, a lot of people sort of pick and choose chapters in Agrippa. They pick out chapters at random, and they will often get some good information out of that. But there's a lot of background knowledge that's not there. And, rather than simply saying Agrippa was being careless or disorganized or secretive, in some cases he was doing all of those things. But part of the reason is I always use the analogy of some cookbooks. I gave an example. In French cooking, you have these mother sauces. They have a section on making these basic foundational sauces for French cooking. And then later on the chapter on chicken, they'll say, use the sauce. and they're not going to give you a recipe for that sauce. So if you don't understand the concept of making the sauce, you're never going to make the dish to begin with. So that's, in a sense, what Agrippa is doing. He's laying out these foundations early on in the book, and then later on revisits those top-level concepts in a different way.
Indeed, it is egregious sin that I have done this so many times, Eric. I have gone to book 2 or book 3 and, let me look this up really, really quick. And I hope the listeners can join me in admitting this egregious sin, because it is something that you recommend. Hey, it's okay if you do want to check out, one chapter, but make sure that at least when you go through it the first time, make sure to just understand where it's coming from. Make sure to understand the context. It sounds like that's what's really important.
And he doesn't really tell you all the time. Frankly, I really couldn't note all that, annotate all that. That's a different book to do that. I couldn't do in this edition. Otherwise, it would be double the size. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to do that ever. Maybe someone else will do it.
People often say that Agrippa hid information in the 3 books. And as you say, sometimes he's actually doing that. But can you explain what it means when you mentioned that Agrippa scattered the information? Is it really as mysterious as it sounds, or is there more logic to it?
It's mostly logical, I think. In the last chapter of 3 books, he says that he made some of the knowledge obscure, some of it he scattered, and some he left out. A lot of people have this initial impulse to sort of do a Da Vinci Code on it. I think to some extent there's a little bit of that, but I think it's just mostly practical, because to a fair degree, it's the scenario that I just mentioned, that it's not practical to always lay out all of your arguments every single time they come up. So you have to do that. But there are some cases where he did not want certain things to be easily understood. He also says that if anybody is curious enough about the subject and they're diligent enough to do this, then they can find the books themselves. And I did that. Now all the readers will have those books available to them. But from an astrological standpoint, I can definitely vouch for that, because Agrippa doesn't really talk about a lot of the things that you can do in astrology. There's, like, for instance, there's a throwaway comment that I noticed when I was translating it, where he mentions doing an electional chart. And he says that you can, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something to the effect of that you can do a chart for an event or for a thing. And I started thinking about that. And I suddenly had realized that you can make electional charts on finding the demonic name for the presiding demon. And I realized that while you can find the names of your presiding demons astrologically, he tells you how to do it. But you can also do that for ceremonies, or you can do that for anything. And my friend and I, Marcus, have taken advantage of this a few times, where I've done elections for some of the things that he's made, but also finding the demonic names for those objects. So it's just fascinating. It's a fascinating idea.
So you and Marcus literally took Agrippa's advice. You found the books and the sources, and you did the experimentum, so to speak.
Right. Because I already had knowledge in electional astrology, which Agrippa tells you the bare bones, but I've done it myself a lot. Yeah, but it's a fascinating idea, because that kind of gave us a new dimension to the things that we were doing. And to me, that's an example of what Agrippa's talking about, not just going and finding the books yourself, but that if you understand this basic concept that he's saying, and you know enough about the subject, then you can run with that and do something he's not really talking about explicitly. And that's the real value of books like this, I think.
He's not going into detail like, this is Agrippa's 28 steps to a magical circle construction. He's saying, why are you engaging with a circle? Why are you lighting a candle? Why are you doing this? Kind of giving the truly philosophical foundations to the experimentum. And then it's up to you at that point to not only, as you say, find the books, but then to take it in perhaps a brand new direction that hasn't been explored before.
And also just internalizing what he's talking about, even if you don't find the books. It was a little bit disappointing to me with the sources, because while I found all these sources, I started realizing that, like I said, with Harmonia Mundi, Agrippa, to a great extent, really used a lot of the juiciest parts of the books, with the exception of the astrology books. He quotes Picatrix, but there's a lot in Picatrix that's worth getting by itself. But, Reuchlin, there are English translations of the Art of Kabbalah, but unless you're really studying Kabbalah on its own, for your average magical practitioner, Agrippa is kind of digesting really what you need, I think. It's a little bit of a spoiler.
You mentioned that you had to not only do this incredible amount of research to find the sources, but then you had to validate these sources. Can you walk us through the process? Like, what does it mean to validate a source, and how did you go about doing this?
To a large extent, the critical edition told me what a lot of these were, but I didn't want to take their word for it. That gets us into trouble. And I actually did find a couple of mistakes. And I also found a few sources that they didn't find. Basically, what I did was I started out with a list that they had, because in some cases the pagination is different in different editions. So and you can't do a PDF search. So I had to go through, and yes, there are times when I would spend a day or two trying to find a passage.
Wow.
There's no secret to it. It's literally doing it the hard way. There's no shortcut to that. I mean, some of it's easy. When he quotes Virgil, I mean, that's easy. He'll mention, like in Harmonia Mundi is divided in a very strange way. And they would sometimes cite the pagination to it. But I found some variables there. And so I would have to go through and just read the entire chapter to find it sometimes. You also discover things. There are a few cases where, it would be a quote, but then you would find out that, this quote's part of a larger passage talking about something. That actually revealed a few things too. And some of those I noted. Agrippa would make a throwaway comment about something, and the quote was from part of a sentence in Harmonia Mundi, but then I would find out that sentence is actually talking about the astrological correspondences of the 12 tribes of Israel and all this kind of stuff. And that was kind of a fascinating process. And you find errors, and you find out where Agrippa made a mistake. There is one where he quoted the books of Pluto, and JF translated it that way. And the Latin says books of Pluto. And then I think Tyson tried to figure out what that was. And then I looked at the source. It was Plato, of course. Yeah.
Spending so many years, Eric, to that point, as you have going through this, what were some of the biggest overall surprises that you encountered while either translating the text or comparing sources? Mm-hmm. You've touched on a few surprises, but what were some of the big things that maybe we haven't talked about so far where you were like, wow, this is an interesting thing that I don't think anyone's ever really maybe looked at before?
The biggest surprises, I think, was because I was doing such a close read that I found things like that passage about the demon names, for instance. Things like, actually in that same section, it's just a small paragraph where he mentions all these different ways of calculating demon names. And I realized that it was like a Russian nesting doll when I was trying to break this apart. It was a very easy passage to translate. That wasn't the problem. But I started thinking about the method, and I actually wrote an article about it for a Three Hands Press. I wrote an article about this exact thing. He'll say things like, find the ruler of the ninth house, for instance. But I started realizing there were different ideas that he could have been possibly talking about. So unpacking that kind of thing was fascinating. And I think that also when I realized the extent of the quoting that he was doing was absolutely fascinating, because I've read Ficino deeply. And even in Platonic Theology, which is a book about Plato, obviously, isn't that dense. It's mostly Ficino writing. I don't think anybody assumed that Agrippa he was doing a William Burroughs cut up technique on this in a way, except he wasn't throwing it in the air. That was a huge surprise. And I've told it to a lot of people, and the responses are either awe or just total dismissal of Agrippa because he was plagiarizing. And
But see, that's one of the big things that you mentioned, which I think is important for, I know myself, and I hope the listeners to keep in mind, which is back in the day, quote unquote, like 400 years ago, to plagiarize, to cite sources was really a way of showing other people what you knew. It was showing the kind of scope and the circumference of your knowledge at the time.
Right. And I should have known that, because I was accustomed to astrological texts, and older astrological texts do the same thing. And the pattern is usually something like, Bonatti says this, Al-Kindi says this, Plato says this, but I do this. I should have known that would have been the case here. But Agrippa does this so seamlessly, you don't notice it. A lot of times I always catch myself, because I always say, well, Agrippa said this and Agrippa said that. And I realized, no, it was Ficino saying that. or was Albertus, Magnus or somebody like that.
How was the process itself for you, Eric, of reading and translating the 3 books compared to, say, other texts that you've worked on?
I didn't have as much of a problem with that because my primary source was the critical edition, which is modern text. And almost all of my sources were printed. So they were printed since the 1500s, I guess. Early printed Latin texts do have their own abbreviations. And I was already used to the long S, but I was not accustomed to some of those Latin abbreviations at the time because I just wasn't at that level at the time. So I had to sort of give myself a schooling there. There were a few manuscripts. My source on the 15 fixed stars was a manuscript, and that was tough. It's not even an old one. I think it's from the 1600s.
Was it just spending all day finding just one passage? Was it sitting down with this and just grinding?
There's no secret to this at all. There's no shortcut. And manuscripts are rough. Latin manuscripts, especially.
When you're spending that day to day and hours and hours and hours, day in and day out, how do you keep yourself A, energized, and B, when you come across another passage, how do you prevent yourself from going down a rabbit hole? Because I would be so tempted to like, oh my gosh, what about this? What about that? How do you stay focused on that?
There were some rabbit holes. There definitely were. I am an obsessive person, and I always set little tiny goals for myself. So I noticed that I could comfortably, on average, translate about 3 pages. But certain chapters are different. Like, some of the, what I call list chapters, like the Mansions of the Moon and the Decans and that kind of thing. Those I just flew through. So I might be able to do that in a day or less than a day. And I could go into a different chapter, but I usually tried to finish a chapter a week, which didn't always work out. You have to take bite-sized chunks. And then I'd have a nice Manhattan after I translated.
Very good. Some chapters for you, boom, you just kind of flew through. What was the most difficult chapter, or at least the one that felt like this is World War I trench warfare, where you spend just hours and hours and you feel like you're only gaining a few inches of ground? What was the big thing?
The chapter on the number 7.
Really?
I hate that chapter. It's a large chapter. It wasn't difficult as far as translation goes, but it was tedious. Because the first part of the chapter is normal. Like, okay, well, the Pythagoreans say this, and the Stoics said this, and then we say this kind of a thing. And here are all the times they said the number 7 in the Bible. And I absolutely hated doing that. And it was funny because I had to footnote all this. And on my manuscript in Microsoft Word, 12-point Times New Roman font, it would be more than half of a page of footnotes because it was so dense.
Oh.
And when the editor sent me it was actually the first 2 passes of the edits of that chapter. You could tell I was zoning out when I translated it because there were a couple things in there where I don't even know why I said some of the things I said. They weren't really necessarily difficult things to translate. It's just when you have page after page after page on the number 7, you get to a point where you just can't look at the Bible anymore.
I think so many people might be familiar with that chapter, and they might be familiar with, of course, the number 7 and looking at occult or esoteric applications of the number 7 and using Agrippa as a source. Yet for civilians, for quote unquote people like myself on the outside, we might have no idea how much effort actually goes into that. Only someone like yourself and other scholars and researchers would have. So
Agrippa knew it.
Yeah. That is true.
The Bible loves the number 7. And the other chapter that was, none of these things were as much of a difficulty thing. It was more of a tedium thing. But his chapter on the different opinions on death, that was a bit difficult too. It's a large chapter of Agrippa saying, and this person says, but these people believe. And then this other person says, and after a while, you start zoning out.
So in total, Eric, how many years have you spent working on this new translation of the 3 books of occult philosophy?
It's about 10 years.
So a decade from the first time that you said, hey, I'm reading the existing sources. I think a new translation needs to happen. 10 years of research and source confirmation, source verification, translation, working on drafts. Wow.
It started with me getting the critical edition, and I just naively assumed that was a new English translation. Like I thought it was going to be a Latin English critical edition. And then I got the book and it was all Latin. And I thought to myself, okay, well, that's not helping very much. So I tackled it myself, The initial impulse was I knew that there were some problems and I wanted to be able to compare. And when I first started translating it, I did a few random chapters and I just wanted to see if I could do any of it. So I think my goal was to do 6 chapters. And I remember talking to Christopher Warnock one day and I said, I started doing this. And he goes, oh, great. Let me know if you finish it. He didn't think I was going to finish it. I didn't know if I was going to finish it. I wasn't thinking of publishing it. I didn't really think anybody would want to read it. It just wasn't part of my, Alexander raises his hand. I just wasn't thinking that way. My friends pushed me to go further and go big.
We do, Eric, have a listener question for you from Joshua Stevens, who is asking on the release date for the 3 books of occult philosophy. Can you just share with the listeners about the release date?
November 16th. There's been confusion with the publication of the book. This is the 3rd publisher I worked with. I initially wanted to translate it with Christopher Warnock because, again, at the time, I just wasn't thinking very much about the book. And my first impulse was just getting it out there. And then I started to realize that I needed professional editing, and which is something that is sorely missing from a lot of occult books. So I went to another publisher, and that resulted in a lot of delays. There was some confusion for a while because I published book 1 in 2012, I believe, with Christopher Warnock. And he stopped selling it when he realized when I went to a different publisher. But that book is now expensive online. If you find it, it's more than I would pay for it. So a lot of people, I think, were confused about my intentions on how I was going to publish the book, or was I publishing them separately over time, over a number of years. And I was sternly talked to by someone thinking that I was purposely selling the original edition for it was hundreds of dollars. And I told him I had nothing to do with that. Now I'm working with a very tight schedule with Inner Tradition. So they're a very organized publisher with firm deadlines. So it is going to be published. It's going to be published all at once. So no onesies, twosies with this.
What are 2 or 3 big things, Eric, that you want readers to always kind of keep in mind in the back of their minds before they begin to delve into your book and then go through it? Or asked in the inverse, what are 2 or 3 things that you think readers should not do or should not assume about Agrippa or the 3 books as they go through your work?
We discussed a little bit of it already. One of those is that it's not a reference book. Picking and choosing material based on the chapter heading, I don't think it's going to be misleading, but it will be insufficient. It'll be incomplete. But also, I think it's important to learn to take, and this isn't just Agrippa, but it's especially important with Agrippa, but any of these old texts, it's important to take these on their own terms as much as possible. So we tend to sort of dismiss some information because we think we know better, or we second guess what we think they're saying. And I want to get to that in a second, actually. That's a bigger point. The other thing I thought of too is that and I think I mentioned this too, is not to dismiss Agrippa because he doesn't have rituals in it. That's not the point of the book. One of the issues with both astrology and occult books is that they tend to be technique heavy. And in our illustrious internet forums that we all know and love, there are endless arguments about technique. This is something that my leukemia experience, I think, really made me understand at a young age, is that 21st century Westerners, and I especially see it with Americans because I'm more informed about American culture, we tend to take things very one way or the other. For instance, in Agrippa's section on the planetary rulerships of plants and animals and everything, they'll say things like sandalwood, for instance. So sandalwood will be on the list for Mars, and it'll also be on the list for Venus. And from a very one-to-one sort of scientific standpoint, that should be wrong, because how could it be ruled by 2 things or 2 planets? again, online, you see these arguments about what is sage good for? And then people go on all this endless discussion about the things that it's good for. And then people argue about it. No, it's not good for that. It's good for this. And according to this source, it's this. And after a while, I think you start missing the forest for the trees. So the reason why I mentioned leukemy is that in our 21st century Western world, we've basically destroyed our relationship with the spiritual. And we are not raised to think in those terms. We are raised to think in materialistic scientific terms, which is good for certain things. But we tend to have a very absolute way of looking at reality. Actually, this is very prevalent in astrological sources. Like they'll give a list of plants that are ruled by a particular planet from one ancient source. And then you look at a different ancient source and it's a completely different list. The part we're leaving out is that if you live in a society that believes in spirit, in magic and astrology as a reality, as an objective reality, then you're going to approach these things from a very holistic kind of organic standpoint. So in leukemy, for instance, to pick on leukemy, one of the more well-known examples is a simple divination that we do for kind of yes and no answers is with coconuts. We break open a coconut, scoop out the coconut part out of the shell, and then we have 4 palm-sized pieces of coconut. One side is concave and white, the other is convex and brown. That's called obi in leukemy. Technically, obi is not coconut at all. It's a particular kind of 4-lobed kola nut that's in Nigeria or in Africa. When the slaves came from Nigeria to Cuba, they have kola nuts in Cuba, but they don't have the 4-lobed variety. So they had to come up with a substitute. And the substitute they decided on was coconut. So coconut's an entirely different plant than kola nut. Yet we have this whole practice. In Seattle here, we can get 4-lobed kola nut, but I use coconut still. It's the tradition now. And from a one-to-one scientific standpoint, that should be completely wrong. Other examples is if, certain plants are not available, then we find alternate plants to use. There's a way of kind of dealing with this fluidity that happens with the spiritual world. And unfortunately, that kind of knowledge does not happen in books. It is not conveyed in books. That's kind of like the argument that we hear a lot that has been discussed on your show of approaching Solomonic magic literally or not literally. That's a very common argument. The answer is that we don't know the minds of the people who wrote those books. We know what they wrote down. We don't know exactly how they were performing the magic themselves and to what degree they were making substitutions on the fly, or literally. We don't know if these people were being literal all the time. They probably were trying to be literal as much as possible, I'm sure, because everybody does. So I think that sort of literal thinking is something that I hope someone can look past when they're reading texts like this. If you internalize the logic that Agrippa is talking about, he's talking about qualities. He's talking about spiritual realities that can be fluid from one person or one culture to another. And that's not really conveyed very well in a book on recipes. And we see the same problem in astrology. There's endless books on technique. There was a actually very important book by al-Biruni that was written in the sort of the late medieval Arabic period. It's a large book on astrological principles. And for years, the main edition that we had available in print was one where someone took out all of the philosophical and technical details or mathematical sections and only had the astrological techniques. Same thing with some other astrology books where they've only reproduced the chart reading sections of it or delineatory sections of it, but not the mathematical and philosophical sections of it. Now we have people who are doing magic and doing astrology with no philosophical idea of what they're doing. I think it causes a lot of confusion. I think the purpose of going down this road isn't to read Agrippa or someone like Agrippa and say, okay, I'm an Agrippan magician, for instance, to give yourself that label. Or it's not to read philosophy and say that I'm an Aristotelian or a Neoplatonist or a Stoic or whatever. The purpose is that these books are there to teach you how to learn, to ask the right questions, and to think astrologically and magically. We're not raised in that right now, so we have to sort of change the way we think a little bit. And you can do both. You can do both at the same time, by the way, because we live in the 21st century. I've said this before, there's a saying that knowledge tells you that tomato is a fruit, but wisdom tells you not to put tomatoes in fruit salad. And that's where the philosophical, I think, training comes in, is you might be deviating from the book sometimes, but if you are connected with the spiritual part of it, you can know that something is correct. But there's a fine line between that kind of mediumship and then making stuff up on the fly. The other extreme is not good either. That gets us into trouble. It takes a lot of experience, a lot of learning. The other argument is armchair magician versus practitioner. Well, the truth of the matter is we all have to be armchair magicians for, sometimes, 3 books is sort of the ultimate armchair book.
Tell me if this sounds fair, Eric. Based on what you're saying, the goal should be to, whether it's Agrippa's 3 books or any esoteric or magical text, is to internalize the thought process, to internalize the elements and the approach, kind of how it was being done, but at the same time, not to fetishize and concretize to the point of petrification specific ways of this is the only way to do things and sandalwood must only be used for this. Is that somewhat fair?
It's not only fair, but that's also not what the writers of these books did. They were part of a different culture than we're in right now. And we have to remember that. Another example is with astrology. I've been spending, a little while now, trying to understand some of the astronomical bases of astrology, because it is rooted in astronomy. It's shocking how many astrologers don't know this. And you don't have to be an astronomer, but when you look at a chart, what are you actually looking at? Because it's not really, you can't just say it's the sky at that moment, because that's not literally true. And there are also different ways to look at the sky. So what way are you looking at it? Why do we pick that method to look at the sky in that way to do astrology? And not understanding these really basic primary principles makes people over time do some very strange things with their practices. Like in astrology, in modern astrology, there's been a problem. Magic and astrology have almost parallel histories in some ways. In a very brief nutshell, both magic and astrology declined, especially in print, in the 1700s sometime. Roughly, there's exceptions to all of this. I can name books of both magic and astrology that are exceptions, but for the most part, because of the rise of the Enlightenment in scientific worldviews. And then the resurgence for both magic and astrology happened through the rise of theosophy. So theosophy, I think in many ways, if theosophy didn't come into the scene, the resurgence of astrology and magic would be very different today. I don't know what form it would take. But the downside of theosophy is that it inserted non-magical and non-astrological and non-Western ways of thinking. And it isn't that Western way of thinking is wrong or better or worse than anything else, but it's difficult to understand what, say, Agrippa is talking about while trying to approach this in a watered down European version of Hinduism. And the same thing happened with astrology. There was a gradual process where people decided that they did not want astrology to be seen as, of course, derogatory gypsy fortune telling, way of looking at things. And we would never say that today, but that's how they looked at it. They wanted to sort of make the magic and astrology more, quote, respectable. So they became kind of inserted into this, again, watered down Hindu way of looking at spirituality, but also eventually through a psychological lens. And that has happened to the detriment of both magic and astrology. So now astrology has, until its recent history, lost a lot of its predictive tools. And that's now coming back gradually. It isn't really only until the last few years when the occult world is seriously questioning this whole psychological basis for astrology now, or even for magic. So now you have a lot of people who actually are believing that spirits are objective, discrete beings from ourselves, separate from ourselves. But 30 years ago, it was a different scene. Now we're starting to kind of reclaim some of that a little bit. It's very difficult for people to, give up their chains. So thankfully, we're getting a lot of good sources, a lot of good new translations, because, really until recently, the only source of, quote, Hermeticism was the Kabbalion and people were reading Manly Hall as like the main source of occult history. And Crowley and the Golden Dawn are kind of, there's definitely been a lot of criticism, more recently of that. I don't think that those are inherently good or bad, but people are now starting to look beyond all that, looking beyond the Victorian and early 20th century material. And Agrippa is an important part of this because, Agrippa is one of the bases of the Golden Dawn and the basis of a lot of books on herbs, stones, correspondences, and that kind of thing. And it's kind of resulted in some misinformation, but also it's being taken for granted to a great degree. I hope that this trajectory keeps going. It's definitely happening in astrology, and I'm not sure. It's hard to gauge where that is with the occult world. I mean, we have a lot of good books, but
really what you're sharing, Eric, is a reminder for whether you are a casual reader, whether you're an armchair magician, whether you're a practitioner, to approach the book and approach the source on its own terms.
Ultimately, we're doing nothing different than what anybody else ever did. When you think about, let's say, astrology, for instance, astrology as we know it was developed by the Greek-speaking Hellenistic world, probably in Egypt, but it was developed during that time. And by the time you get to the Persian period, they're just trying to be good Hellenistic astrology. I mean, there was no division between Hellenistic astrology and non, but in their mind, they're trying to be good astrologers according to all these classical texts that they had available, but they made their own innovations. And these are innovations that I'm very interested in personally, but it isn't the slavish rote learning, as you said. As I said earlier, there's an astrological logic. Like, are you using astrological logic? Because, in astrology, for instance, you have things like the Sabian symbols, which are popular, which are symbols for each of the 360 degrees of the zodiac. Well, first of all, that existed in the medieval period already. I have a book on it. It's essentially based on the natures of those particular signs and the decans and that kind of thing. So it's astrological thinking about it. But the modern Sabian symbols were developed by Mark Edmund Jones, and he used a psychic to intuit what each of these 360 symbols were going to mean, which basically means he wasn't using astrology. I don't have anything against mediumship because I do that myself, and I know many good mediums, but I don't use mediumship to delineate an astrological chart. Just like I don't use astrology to do magic in leukemy, because those two, they don't go together. It's different ways of thinking. So when we're dealing with magic, you have to think in terms of using the logic of the magic that you're actually doing. So if you're doing Solomonic magic, then do the Solomonic magic, but don't bring in the chakras into it, because the chakras have nothing to do with the Solomonic magic.
When you step into a consecrated circle, instead of operating on the physical laws of the universe, you're operating on the laws of meaning. You're operating on the laws of Solomonic magic that, just like the second law of thermodynamics, they have their own logic and reason to them that should be taken on its own terms. I think. Is that fair?
Yes, it is fair. And what makes it confusing is that there is a materialistic side to it. And
absolutely.
It's just compartmentalizing your mind a little bit. But yeah, I never, ever, ever mix and match anything whatsoever. And I think my godfather probably did astrological elections for leukemy ceremonies. I don't really have a problem for that or with that necessarily, but those ceremonies are complicated enough to plan. I'm not going to add astrology on top of that. It's also difficult, I think, for a lot of modern people to really believe that spirits are there, because we second guess ourselves a lot. I mean, it took me years and years to even acknowledge that I was even having any mediumistic thoughts when I was doing magic. I imagined something different. And it wasn't until more years than I care to admit that I learned how to understand when I was actually getting a message. That's just time and effort and training and knowing the right people to tell you things and all that. But you're not going to learn that from a book.
Eric, what was the moment for you engaging in mediumship? What was the moment for you where you said, oh, this is what it's about? Not what I was expecting, but This is what, was it one moment or was it kind of over a period of time?
It keeps happening. Every single time it happens, I haven't really lost the wonder of, holy crap, it actually happened and worked. So as I mentioned earlier, in leukemy, it's very common to also practice this sort of Caribbean or Latin American version of European Spiritism. It's used to help inform the leukemia, but you can also do it entirely independently. And many people do. It's very common. I was going to seances. We call them misas in that, but I was doing seances with my godfather for almost once a week for about 10 years. We were doing this and I never really got much. I didn't really understand like what I was supposed to be looking for. I was expecting a movie. And then when I started working with my current godmother, she always told us that everyone has the abilities, mediumistic abilities of some way, but it's different. So sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's drawing, sometimes they can hear things, sometimes they smell things, they feel things. And for many, many years, I could feel things. And I could always tell when something was nearby because it was like an electrical shock in the back of my neck. I would feel it. And that happened after I got initiated overnight, literally overnight. Nothing happened until I got initiated. And then suddenly it was happening. And I didn't even know if that was the thing that people get. But after a while, through her encouragement, I started just voicing the things that I was thinking. And after a while, I started to be able to recognize which things were my own thoughts and which things were not. The aha moment happened. It still happens, where I will get something and then I'll say, okay, you need to do this sort of a thing. And then I find out that the person was already told that years ago in a reading or in something like that, something they've already been consciously doing but had forgotten to do or forgotten to keep up or something like that. Those kind of moments are pretty, telling. And I started then trusting that with my astrology. So I still do the astrology. I still do the delineations. Everything I say is done with astrological reasoning. And there's no shortcut for that. But what happens is that I'm just going to make up an example. Let's just say Mars signifies your career. But the reality is that, Mars can be, when it comes to career, can mean you could be a fireman, you could be a surgeon, you could be a policeman, you could be a butcher, you could, all sorts of things. You could soldier, obviously. It could be all those things. It narrows down your possibilities, but you still have kind of a range. I started realizing that when I started acknowledging my mediumship, that the astrological delineations got a little bit more precise. I could tell you how I came across the statements I was making, but they'd be more precise. And there were a few times when I would just know that, like, okay, well, this is, talking about your sister. And I don't even know why I said that. And then it turned out, oh yeah, this is going on with my sister right now. It doesn't happen all the time. And I wish I could make it happen every time, but I learned to sort of trust those impulses.
As you mentioned, that still happens, though, those moments of wonder and, wow, this is still actually happening.
That hasn't gone away. And I may have a certain situation going on and I'll get an idea that, okay, I need to do a quick divination with one of my orishas to figure this out. And then I'll do it. The divination will give me something totally different than what I was thinking or what I assumed the answer was supposed to be. And then I would just kind of like, all right, let me see what happens if I go this direction. And it would work out exactly the way the divination came out, unambiguously. I remember one time I was trying to get back into leukemia after my hiatus, and I didn't know anybody. And I was trying to find someone local, and Seattle is one of the worst places, or the Pacific Northwest is one of the worst places to practice this because there aren't that many people. And one of the issues I was having was money at the time. So I was talking to this guy who, I don't really trust him, honestly, but he was a Santero, but he gave me one piece of advice that was really good. And he goes, oh, you just take your orishas and you do this. It's a very simple thing. Gave me some very simple instructions. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense what you're telling me. And I knew it wasn't going to hurt anything. So I said, okay, this is what I need. And then 2 weeks later, I get a raise. So things like that happen. When things are that cut and dry, it really changes but it doesn't mean that every time anybody works with an orisha, they're going to get money. Magic doesn't work that way.
The world is full of coincidences, but you know that you're starting to engage in an esoteric tributary when you start scheduling your own coincidences to happen, Yeah,
there's a saying I heard a long time ago that's similar to that. That's magic is the art of causing coincidences. It's almost the same thing as you said.
That is wonderful. That was probably the exact discussion that I was in. Someone referenced that. Oh my goodness. We do have one more listener question for you regarding Agrippa from Douglas of What Magic Is This? And Douglas is asking, on magical ceremonies in the 4th book of Occult Philosophy, did Heinrich write it?
The short answer is nobody knows. For a while, I was thinking of doing a translation of it. And I gave up on it because there didn't seem to be as much of a need for it, because I think the translation seemed like it was pretty good. First of all, the fourth book comes from Agrippa's Opera Omnia compilation, which came out after he passed. And so initially, without looking at it, I assumed that there was just a section in his Opera Omnia that said fourth book of occult philosophy, and it was exactly like the Turner edition. And I started discovering that it isn't really that definite. So there is a section called the fourth book, and it's very small, just like in the Turner edition. It's the first part of the book. And there's a section on geomancy in there. And I think it's possible Agrippa wrote those sections. Maybe he didn't call it the fourth book himself. Maybe that was added by somebody. But I don't think it's entirely inconsistent that he may have written that. But where it gets murky is the rest of the book. So we know the heptameron's in there. So we know he didn't write that. That's no one's arguing that. But I realized when I was looking at the Opera Omnia that the rest of the book, there's no clear division once you get past the heptameron, because then you start getting into different letters that he wrote and some other essays that he wrote that are not in the Turner edition. And the last part of the Turner edition comes from a different part of the Opera Omnia that isn't really part of that section of the books. I don't know. It gets really weird after a bit. A fair amount of the Opera Omnia is also Agrippa's commentary, and in the case of Heptameron, he just put it's just in there. I don't know why it was even put in there, because he didn't translate it. So that's a bit strange. So I think that it's possible he wrote the first part, but I don't think Agrippa ever intended the fourth book to be this volume that we have.
Thank you for that.
You know, the geomancy, I think, is from someone else too, if I remember correctly. I think that's from Gerard of...
Yeah, I think that might be why Douglas was asking that too, because you're right. It's attributed to Agrippa, but as you just so eloquently demonstrated, there were certainly parts that maybe Agrippa had an influence on. But when you look at the fourth book as a whole...
But, you know, this is material that's in the Opera Omnia. So it isn't just some dude writing a book and saying, I'm Agrippa. It wasn't that simple, because someone took it from a book with other Agrippa texts. But if you look at the Opera Omnia, there's so much other material in there. One of the things that people forget too is during the Renaissance, it was pretty common to take other books and to kind of insert them into volumes because they were saving money. So I don't know if Agrippa had, like, let's say the Heptameron, for example. I don't know if he, had the Heptameron as part of one of his volumes in his library, so he could have it bound. And maybe whoever did the Opera Omnia just threw that in there because it was part of this volume. I don't know. So it's a little bit of a mystery, but it's so murky. The material in there is it's just all over the place. And I didn't feel confident in translating it, at least not in the form that the Turner edition is. I wasn't as emotionally vested into doing it, but it shouldn't invalidate the book regardless. Someone asked me one time if the fourth book of occult philosophy was a real book. And I said, yes, it is definitely a real book.
Yes, it is a book that exists in space-time, indeed. Eric, to that point, you've mentioned astrology, obviously your decades of experience with astrological readings and the apprehension of astrology. We do have a listener question from Echo for you. And Echo is asking, with astrology being swept aside by even some occult circles as fluff, Echo says, I've been having a difficult time finding spaces to chat with other astrologers as peers instead of performing the traditional Scorpio placement measuring contest, which is such a boring and outdated type of mindset. And so Echo's saying, in my own recent experiences, it seems that I most naturally read with a blend of traditional, medical, herbal, and contacted astrology techniques. But with all the infighting and bickering in the astro community, it's hard to know, Echo says, where to find resources to explore these themes with any amount of integrity. What advice, Eric, would you give to a fellow, albeit far less experienced astrologer who, while still developing their own unique reading style, is looking to deepen their knowledge, vocabulary, and understanding in somewhat uncharted territory? Echo is saying, especially since most reputable astrological texts seem to stop far sooner in history than those of biology and botany.
This is an aside, but what's funny about mentioning the infighting was that was the reason why I originally left Leukemia years ago, is because of all the infighting and drama that I was seeing. And trust me, the fighting that you see in the occult world is nothing compared to what you see in leukemy. There's some nasty stuff going on that can happen there. But that's why I left. And then I assumed that when I started studying astrology that I would have, since I have no elders and no one I had to report to, that it wouldn't really matter. Then I started seeing that the same thing was sort of happening in the astrology world again, where people were fighting and arguing and doing a lot of one-upsmanship, that I had the revelation that I basically am just going to do what I do. And because at the end, you're only accountable to yourself. You have control over your narrative, so you don't have to necessarily get involved in the things that you don't want to get involved in. That was an important lesson I had to learn myself. So astrology, right now, it's a little bit fragmented as far as getting started. The first question people always ask is, what book should they read? And with traditional astrology, it's a little tough because there aren't that many books that are written about traditional astrology by a modern author, but there are a few. These are all pretty recent, relatively recent, and they're very well done. If you know nothing about traditional astrology, there's a really good book called On the Heavenly Spheres by Avelar, and I'm not sure if I pronounced his name correctly. I love their stuff. Ribeiro, they're Portuguese. It's On the Heavenly Spheres, and it's a very clear explanation of the astrology of William Lilly, especially. They don't go into specific techniques, predictive techniques, but they explain very clearly about some very basic techniques, such as, essential dignities, the house meanings, planetary meanings, what happens when a planet is weak, what happens when a planet is strong, just really basic knowledge. That's a really good place to start for that. Chris Brennan has an excellent book on Hellenistic astrology, which I think is just called Hellenistic Astrology. It's an excellent book. It's huge. He goes very detailed into that as well. And there's going to be differences between the Lilly style of astrology and the Hellenistic astrology. But I think, broad strokes, they're good places to start. There is an issue with astrology in the occult world, in that the occult world still really hasn't embraced astrology because of the perception that it's just, fluffy new age, like the question said. That's certainly true today. I mean, there's a lot of fluffy astrology out there. There's some very advanced books. There's some new translations by Ben Dykes. I recommend most of his translations, if not all of them. There's a book on natal astrology by Sahl, Sahl, that Ben Dykes translated from Arabic. And another one on yearly predictive techniques by Abu Mashar. William Lilly will give you a pretty good list on planetary correspondences for herbs, plants, and even places. These are kind of basic tools that are good. The thing is that's hard with people getting involved in traditional astrology for the first time is that there are a lot of differences that you don't expect. For instance, a really basic one is traditional astrology doesn't use sun signs. So there is no traditional astrology book that will say, I'm an Aries, I'm a Pisces, I'm a whatever. That was not language they used. And it was extremely uncommon for a traditional astrologer to even describe someone according to a sign, because signs were used differently than they are today. So signs today are pretty much character descriptions. And in traditional astrology as a whole, I'm simplifying a lot, are zones of modifying planetary strength and significations. It's really about planets. There's a whole different way of looking at it than in modern astrology. It is not fluffy. Some of it gets pretty spooky. Horary astrology, Horary astrology, can get a little spooky for some people because those are astrological readings that you do for specific questions like, will I get this house? Will I get this job? Things like that. And you can get pretty detailed with that, with those questions. Astrological magic is becoming more and more popular today. I think more occultists today are becoming more curious about astrology, but there's still this kind of divide where I see a lot of occultists saying things like, you don't need astrology, or it's too superficial, or arguments like that. And they don't really realize that the astrology is kind of like the basic language for Western occultism. It's nice to be able to understand the astrology from traditional terms, because that's where these sources are coming from. Like the Keys of Solomon, they have these kind of basic elections, and those don't work from a planetary magic standpoint, like pick a trick style planetary magic. But, even those kinds of elections if you're working with something that's, say, Mars related, it's nice to know what Mars represents and the things that Mars rules. And Agrippa talks about that. But the botanical names, if you're getting started, William Lilly, and there's a good book on traditional herbal medicine by Culpeper. And these books are free. They're in the public domain. There are some nice printed editions, and that's a really nice way to get started. I don't think these are really that authoritative. And Lilly, I have some problems with, but I still like them. I use them for certain things still. Culpeper goes into some of the astrological correspondences because they would have used astrology for cures. He has a pretty large list of plant correspondences. That's a very good source to start with.
We do have another question, Eric, for you from Lucid Themes, who is asking, regarding his Santero experience, does Mr. Purdue have a favorite Odu and why?
So I can't answer that question directly because a lot of elders in Lukumi don't like discussing a lot of deep knowledge with the Odus to the general public for several reasons. And it isn't all because it's just proprietary knowledge. Some of it is, but a lot of it is that it's very context based. But for those who don't know what this is, because I think a lot of people don't know what that is to begin with, an Odu is, you can sort of think of it in terms of a sign in divination. I don't think that's not strictly accurate, but if I'm making an analogy. So in the two main divination systems, on one hand, you have Dilagun, which is done by Santeros, Olarishas like me, or Ifa divination, which is done by Babalaos. Both use the same signs. These are called Odus, and there are 256 of these, two groups of 16. And these 256 Odus can come in a variety of different orientations, either with blessings or with afflictions. And even amongst those categories, there's a whole list of different afflictions and blessings that you can have. It can get pretty complex and very detailed. In the old days, and we're not talking that far back, probably up until mid 20th century or so, it was pretty common for, like, when you got a reading, they would just tell you one of the proverbs associated with the Odu and probably a story, because each one of those Odus have proverbs and stories. And it was kind of up to you to figure it out. And over the years, it developed into a thing where they give you the proverbs and the stories, but then they would also interpret it. So now you have these interpretations that are associated with these Odus. Further background. So when they're asking about my favorite Odu, when you're initiated as an Olarisha or a Santera, you get a reading on the third day. That's called an Ita. And Itas can happen when you receive certain Orishas. And Itas are readings that stick for the rest of your life. So whatever it says, you have to sort of deal with that for the entire life. You have casual readings you can do just to see how things are going on right now. That's more ephemeral. And that could talk about a situation or the next month or something like that. But Itas are, they stick. And the Ita that you get when you're initiated is the stickiest of, of readings that you get. And you get a full reading for every Orisha that you receive during your initiation, which is a minimum of 5 and sometimes 6 and sometimes more, depending on situations. I've seen 9 happen in one day. So what they do is they do a full reading for this one Orisha, then they go around and they do it again for the next Orisha, and they do the whole thing and it gets written down. So to talk about my favorite Odu is kind of a hard thing because it's so situational. The one thing that Olarishas typically do not do is describe their main Odu, because that kind of gives away your secrets a little bit. There are some people that disagree with that, but a lot of people will tell you not to do that, not to tell people who that is. But speaking broadly, there's some really cool things. I really like the proverbs that they have. Some of them are pretty cryptic and they have to be kind of deciphered. But one of my favorite ones is a dog has 4 legs but only takes one path, and which basically is saying that even though they have these 4 things that are allowing them to walk, they still go only one way. So don't do too many things at once. Don't think you can go in 4 directions at the same time. Things like this is a very popular one, he who knows does not die like he who does not know. It's kind of saying in some ways ignorance is bliss. Those of us who are out to get knowledge, well, once you have that knowledge, you have to deal with this responsibility of having this knowledge that you didn't have before. You can't undo that knowledge once you have it. Sometimes you have to be careful what you ask for. There's a lot of ways to interpret that, but that's one of the main ways. One of them that's popular is, it's not really a proverb as much, but there is a proverb, but I can't think of. But the point is that, and this is an important thing for, I think, magicians in general to know, that your tongue has a power to it. And this is relatively well known, but there's a concept called ashe in alchemy, where ashe is sort of like, has a lot of translations, but one of them is almost like a divine energy. And one of the purposes in alchemy is to increase your ashe so that you can work with the deities in a very seamless way and to be able to accomplish things that people without that ashe can accomplish. And I think that idea is kind of cross-cultural. I think, that's in a lot of forms of magic. Some people just have that quote ashe in whatever magic system, even the ones that we make fun of. I mean, it's really cool to make fun of Wicca in occult circles, but I don't know about everybody else, but I've known some Wiccans who are really good at what they're doing. I mean, they're able to accomplish a lot. So the tongue having this ashe is this idea that when you speak something, it will stick in reality, whether that's good or bad. So sometimes in ceremonies, people who know what they're talking about in alchemy ceremonies are very careful about what they say when an Orisha is being born, because they don't really want to negatively affect the whole process, And you see it, people are sitting there gossiping and doing whatever during the ceremony, but the elders who know what they're talking about you can see they're concentrating in a whole different way. Lessons like that you learn from Odus. And there's practical things. I mean, they'll tell you, actually, one of the early readings I had was that I was going to be evicted, which didn't make sense because I was paying rent and I had no problem paying rent. And, my godfather said, no, it says here, you're going to be evicted, really soon. So I left the reading, went over to my house, and there were two guys standing in the doorway, and they said, are you Eric? And I said, yes. And they said, when can you leave? And it turned out that the landlord sold the building to these two men, and they wanted to remodel it right away, and I was in the way. So I was being evicted, even though I was paying rent. It can get pretty spooky. What's interesting is the Odus themselves are, if you start getting into more philosophical Yoruban, that's the African culture that this mainly comes from. When you start getting into more philosophical areas, it's interesting that there's a spiritual presence to the Odus that really don't exist in Western culture and a lot of divination. You can't say the same things about tarot, and there are amazing tarot readers out there that are trustworthy, that they can actually are speaking from something. But the Odus themselves have this, like, as I said before, like this stickiness to them, which doesn't really seem, I don't see it in a lot of other contexts. There's this idea that the Odus are a manifestation of creation that is coming down to you, that like when an Orisha is being born and you do a reading based on that, this Orisha is coming through a specific manifestation of creation. And it's going to govern the way that this Orisha is going to be. So there can be 10 people who receive the same Orishas, and those 10 Orishas are going to be different, which is an absolutely fascinating concept to me, because my partner is also initiated, and I'm initiated to Shango. She's initiated Obatala. And there's only one Shango. So some Orishas come in different, they call them roads, different aspects. Shango only comes in one. So while there's only one Shango, and I'm a priest of Shango, I have a special relationship with Shango. I can't go to her Shango and just be like overly familiar with him and be like, hey, dude, here I am. Here's Eric. And start doing things to her Shango, because it's not mine. It's a different spirit, even though there are similarities. And that's kind of what the lot of these are talking about. Everybody's experience in this is different based on their kind of orientation with creation itself. It's absolutely fascinating.
To that point, Eric, can you share, where can people find you online? Can you talk about some of your different services, readings, astrological engagements, anything that you would like listeners to know? Because you really do have decades and years of experience in these various tributaries.
I have a website, which is creatively called ericpurdue.com. That took me forever to come up with. And I do offer astrological consultations. I do not offer leukemia consultations for a couple of reasons. Number one, I'm still in training, but also because I have mixed feelings on that being public because there's different cans of worms that can get opened through De Lagoon readings. I don't want to have a situation where I do a reading and someone's just casually wanting to know about their job, and then all of a sudden the sign comes up that says you have to get initiated, and the person has no interest in leukemia, and they have to somehow negotiate around this somehow. I have mixed feelings about doing that anyway, but I do astrological readings. So among those things are I do natal chart readings, horary, electional, and there's a reading I do called a spiritual reading where I just concentrate on the parts of the chart that talk about spirits. I also calculate the names of their presiding demons and do their sigils and all that kind of stuff. And I'm always writing. Agrippa's is taking up all my energy right now. One of the things I don't really want to discuss too deeply, but I have a tendency to pick the largest, most complicated things to do. And I'm trying to break that habit a little bit. There's an astrological text that I want to translate that's physically larger than 3 books, but it's never been fully translated. That's going to take me forever, probably. So in the meantime, there are some smaller Hermetic texts that I want to translate that have never been translated in English. That's going to be a much smaller work, a lot more digestible. And it's a mixture of both philosophical and practical Hermetica. So there's especially some astrology, and there's a little bit of divination in there too. Also in early stages of a book on leukemia.
Any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave listeners with?
Oh, that's a huge question.
I know it's not loaded at all, right?
No, not at all. Over the last few years, we've had a marked increase in, really good books, really good translations. The occult world's kind of lagging behind the astrological world in that respect. And what I would like to see, and I'm not sure how this would happen, but young occultists who are just getting started, at least based on what I'm seeing online, which I'm not sure if that's accurate, but I'm a little bit concerned about the material they have available to them sometimes, like some of this popular occult magical literature. And I would like to see the knowledge of these better source texts being known about, things like Jake Stratton-Kent's books and Stephen Skinner's books. And they're not easy books to read at all. But I would like to see some of the older occultists, I think is probably the answer. I'd like to see older occultists supporting the young ones coming up more, hopefully not being too dismissive of their ignorance. Because the astrology world is going pretty well in that direction. I see a lot of young astrologers who are taking really good information and just running with it. I'm pretty strictly traditional in my astrological approach, but I see some good work by some young astrologers who just don't have those hangups. They're taking the knowledge that we're getting from traditional astrology, but also using modern astrology because they don't have those same prejudices we do, us old folks have sometimes. I'm hoping to see more support with the young occultists in that arena. There's too much edgelord stuff happening out there.
Author, scholar, practitioner of medieval astrology, and his new 896-page translation coming out of the classic 3 books of occult philosophy. Eric Purdue, thank you just so much again just for taking the time and joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Listeners, just wow. It was such an honor to have Eric on. There are so many takeaways from his sharing about the 3 books of occult philosophy and why an overhaul of the text is needed. Also, Eric's point about how you don't necessarily learn magic from magic books is such a great reminder to myself, and I hope for you, to always get out there, try new things, get out into the world, elevate your experience, gain experience, explore, and do other things that even tangentially enhance your magical undertakings. Also, thanks to each and every Glitch Bottle patron on Patreon for your support and your questions, which as usual were just such a pleasure to ask and definitely helped enhance the conversation. And if you'd like to support Glitch Bottle and get exclusive perks, please consider hopping on the Glitch Bottle Caravan at patreon.com/glitchbottle. As always, you can subscribe to Glitch Bottle on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. As always, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.